Yes, I'm going to talk about museums and the Anthropocene with this presentation or this lecture that I call Assembling Anthropocenes. The S at the end of Anthropocene is not a typo, it's deliberate. I want to kind of, well, emphasize the plurality of the concept in a way, because I think the whole sort of discussion or the discourse on the concept is quite sort of diverse. Okay, so since it's the 19th of March, I wanted to start with bringing to your attention the sort of global climate strike that is taking place right now. It's organized by Fridays for Future, and while the strikers are not taking to the streets in same amount of as they have been doing the past few years, the global strike this time takes sort of place online and also away from keyboards. But it is united in this address to world leaders, which is sort of conveniently translates to this hashtag, no more empty promises. So the Fridays for Future demands are quite interesting and I think relevant for my talk today. Where they are actually demanding immediate end to all investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction, and completely divest from fossil fuels. The movement also calls for a design of climate policies that consider the welfare of workers and the most vulnerable in society, and call for a more democratic and open citizen involvement in climate decision making. I think this movement and many other organizations led by youths and young people around the world have actually done a lot to change the image sort of we have generally of environmental activism and climate action in the past couple of years, at least here in the global north. While it has changed the portrayal of environmental activism in the media, this representation often overlooks the longer history of activism by indigenous communities and frontline communities and their decades-long fight for environmental and social justice. I still think it's positive that the fact that notions of democracy, citizen involvement, and justice are finally getting more attention and entering this arena of climate change agendas where scientific expertise has long been dominant. And of course, museums, they are picking up on this energy or this change and are to an increasing extent focusing their energy on engaging with young people. Well, like sort of a local example here in Oslo is there's the Klimahuset, which is recently opened, and they are sort of have the sort of youth, young people as sort of the target group and are working in close collaboration with youth-led organizations. For the past 5 or 10 years, museums have been trying, different ways to engage with climate change by addressing sort of, affective aspects of climate change, emotions related to climate change, lived experiences, artistic expressions, all in a sort of an attempt to kind of complement or even move away from this sort of way to sort of explain the science behind climate change. Because traditionally, it has been thought that explaining the science would lead to sort of a more enlightened stance on climate change that will sort of eventually feed into policy changes and decision making. But research in climate communication, for example, has pretty much shown that it doesn't work that way. So in the last 10 years or so, museums have been trying to kind of figure out a way to actually do more kind of impactful communication. And this is sort of a mix between providing understanding on climate change or environmental problems more in general, but also kind of trying to sort of promote action as well. So this kind of leads into my main topic of research, and this presentation is the Anthropocene, which has been taken up by several museums and exhibitions in the last 10 years or so. And the Anthropocene is a concept that has been sort of taken up actually in order to try to sort of come about the topic of environmental problems and climate change. It was described by Helmut Trissler, who is the head of research at the Deutsches Museum, as an innovative framework within the field of environmental humanities to explore human environment relationships. And he did that back in 2013 in relation to the Deutsches Museum's exhibition on the Anthropocene, which I will talk about a little later in the presentation. So right now, it wouldn't really be my first thought that the concept is particularly innovative, but I believe it does provide some interesting framings for museums to think cohesively on environmental issues, grouping together a lot of environmental problems under a single term. It also has opened up for crossing between cultural and natural history, something that I think is quite important, especially within the museum sector. While thinking about the interconnectedness of nature and culture isn't really a new thing, the Anthropocene has actually helped in terms of bridging divides between natural sciences, humanities, and social sciences within the museum field and beyond. And in addition to grouping environmental problems together and crossing disciplines, the Anthropocene is an interestingly sort of flexible concept. While it is originally a geological concept, it has been debated and discussed in different disciplines that reflect on ethical and political issues, and not only issues that are presented as particularly environmental or physical in nature. So what is the Anthropocene? This is sort of a question I usually start all these presentations with. I'm not going to sort of go very deeply into that question right now. I'm trying to kind of address that continuously throughout the presentation. But sort of as a starting point, I'm showing you this short quote taken from a paper written by a few members of the Anthropocene Working Group from 2011, which kind of connects to this, Anthropocene Working Group that has been working on, since 2008, sort of developing a proposal to formalize the Anthropocene as a geological unit in the geological timescale. So the concept sort of within geology isn't really an official sort of part of the Earth's history, but they are kind of still working on it and trying to kind of figure it out. But while this discussion is taking place, the concept has kind of moved beyond geology, and as you probably all know or are familiar with, it has popped up in all places almost, and of course most interestingly for me is museums. So it is kind of an sort of this is kind of the official or unofficial explanation of the geological concept. And for me, it of course raises a lot of questions. One I want to just briefly mention right now is sort of the question of the anthropos in Anthropocene. Sort of what this notion of the action of humans actually means. It doesn't really differentiate which humans they are referring to. So is it possible to say that we are all equally responsible? And I don't really think so. So in order to understand how a concept like the Anthropocene functions as a framework for museums, I want to look into how museums assemble Anthropocenes. I use assembling in relation to assemblage theory developed by Manuel de Landa as sort of a tool for social analysis. Assemblage theory challenges essentialists' arguments and analysis of intrinsic qualities of social forms by drawing attention to sort of the complexity of the social and the contingency and malleability of how different diverse elements sort of gather together or are combined into wholes. For me, this ties to the fact that museums are complex institutions, and in their work, they do not merely reflect ideas or adopt concepts like the Anthropocene as they appear in theory or in the discourse. Museums produce knowledge or assemble them by combining diverse elements, both discursive and material. This means that museums are sites where different disciplines, theoretical approaches, practices, materials, cultural and political interests intersect. So in applying this tool for examining how museums assemble Anthropocenes, I want to go through 3 scales of analysis, starting with the museum object, then moving to an exhibition, and then finally addressing museums as sort of institutions. So it's kind of going from the relatively sort of small to the big, the simple to the complex, but of course it's everything can be complicated. These examples I'm going to use are from my PhD thesis. They are not particularly, it's not like a broad selection. It involves examples from 3 museums in Europe, the Netherlands, and Germany. Well, 3 museums, 2 in Europe, and then 1 in the United States. So my intention here is to look into the processes of assembling and how that contributes to different versions or framings of the Anthropocene, and to reflect on how the discourse on the Anthropocene, museum theories and practices kind of intersect. So, starting with the museum object, I present to you the plastic glomerit. The name plastic glomerit comes from a scientific article published in 2014, written by Patricia Corcoran, Kelly Jaswak, and Charles Moore. In this article, they describe this newfound rock that was discovered at Camilo Beach in Hawaii. And they describe it as an indurated multi-composite material made hard by agglutination of rock and molten plastic. The article presents it as a potential global marker for the beginning of the Anthropocene, relating to the ongoing question of what kind of, what material traces can be considered globally spread enough to actually count as the stratigraphic marker for the starting of the proposed epoch in the geological timescale. Being sort of an assemblage in itself, a conglomerate of marine debris, organic material, beach sand, and basaltic lava fragments held together by Boston plastic. This particular specimen was collected by the Museum, which is a museum for science and culture in The Hague, the Netherlands. And they actually acquired it or brought it from Camilo Beach, specifically to or in connection with their current permanent exhibition called One Planet. The exhibition focuses on the Sustainable Development Goals with 17 different displays dedicated to each of the sort of Agenda 2030 goals. The plastic glomerit, however, is not part of the display focusing on the SDGs, and instead it is located in a glass display accompanied with other geological samples from a very distant past. As you can see here, it's labeled as the building blocks of the Earth. The samples are sort of intended to kind of trace this long history or deep time of Earth history, and sort of showing us that this is the latest development in this history with the introduction of plastics into the environment, a man-made sort of material. So by placing the plastic glomerate in the context of deep time, as part of the building blocks of the Earth, the display also kind of removes the context of Camilo Beach and the plastic glomerate sort of presence and existence before being named a potential marker for the Anthropocene. And and I think it's interesting to kind of think of this whole process of collecting or retrieving this specimen or this sample from Camilo Beach with this very specific intention of sort of framing it within sort of the Anthropocene discourse and presenting it as a sort of part of the building blocks of the Earth, involves these well-known processes of musealization in a way, where you bring in the object and you register it, and it's part of the collection, and then it's put up on display in a glass case, of course. But I've been sort of thinking about this kind of this way of framing, and sort of what about the sort of existence of the plastic glomerate prior to this particular sort of naming of plastic glomerate. And I want to turn to Emalani Case. She wrote an article which is called Caught and Brought in the Currents, Narratives of Convergence, Destruction and Creation at Camilo Beach. There she's reflecting on sort of the multiple narratives surrounding Camilo Beach as a place of, it's called the trash beach. But in her article, she is kind of tracing the knowledge of native Hawaiians and sort of the significance of that beach in sort of native context versus sort of the colonial context, which has contributed to sort of how the beach is actually sort of seen as today as this sort of remote and almost inaccessible place, this trash beach or plastic beach. And this, of course, ties to the kind of hypervisibility of the white presence in Hawaii and sort of the colonial framings of the island as a retreat, getaway, and so of course this beach doesn't really fit into that categorization. So I'm just going to read the quote, and I'm sorry it's a bit long, but Camilo, with its strong and storied currents, disrupts the fantasy. Rather than being an escape, it is a constant reminder of connection, and more importantly, of the realities of the world. It reminds us that there is no escape, that islands and oceans are always open, that what we do in one place, despite distance, can and will impact another place, and that our neglect for the environment can come back and hit us with force, washing up on our shores, whether we are ready for it or not. Camilo, therefore, cannot be made visible, at least not in the colonizers' framing of Hawaii. It cannot be claimed by tourism or even marked as a colonial possession, in other words, because such claiming would require much more accountability and responsibility, and not all are ready for that. Thus, reframing Camilo, making it visible for the stories and lessons it can teach us is essential. So I want to keep I want you to keep these potential lessons in mind, the lessons on accountability, responsibility, and colonial logics and framings, as I will return to it later. While the plastic glomerate in the glass case at Museum does certainly remind us that the plastics we throw away never really go away, and that the responsibility lies with human activity, but it doesn't really go much deeper than that. So, to our next sort of scale, I want to talk about the exhibition at the Deutsches Museum in Munich, Germany, which was called Welcome to the Anthropocene, the Earth in Our Hand. And I want to start with, because it was a fairly big exhibition, and it was divided into a couple of different sections. And I want to start with this wall that they constructed within the exhibition space, which was, well, often referred to as the wall of Anthropocenic objects. So here they are doing kind of a similar sort of work as the display case at Museum, except that they are kind of displaying technological objects, but they are telling a story of telling the history of the Anthropocene and tracing it back to the invention of the steam engine, which is located in the middle of the wall. And this is kind of in line with what Paul Crutzen, who is usually sort of seen as the sort of the one who started this whole sort of Anthropocene discussion back in 2000, where he proposed that this should be sort of regarded as a geological epoch, sort of the age of man. And he mentions the steam engine as a potential sort of starting point of that, with sort of leading from this invention, you see the increased emissions of CO2 in the atmosphere. So in this display, the museum positions the steam engine in the middle, and then you have like these lines that point to different kind of technological advancements and different sort of technological sort of fields within transport, agriculture, information technology, and household electronics. These are objects from the museum's collection, and they bring it together and sort of focus on this the environmental impact of these inventions, which is pretty sort of a huge step for this museum that is focused on science and technology and has for over 100 years been trying to kind of elevate these inventions as masterpieces of human history. So putting them in this context where you have these consequences, environmental consequences, kind of creates this interesting tension. This wall presents this kind of origin story of the Anthropocene, but as soon as you walk through the wall, there are openings, and you can walk around it as well. You enter a different space, and here you can see a blueprint of the exhibition, and the wall is here, if you can see my mouse pointer. So behind the wall, you see 6 different sort of platforms, which have different themes relating to the Anthropocene. And here you have a very different sort of presentation of the Anthropocene. You're not any longer thinking about sort of, this history of the Anthropocene. You are pretty much just, in the Anthropocene. You're surrounded by it. And these platforms have, sometimes been referred to as tectonic plates, sort of, keeping with the sort of geological references. And it's, there's no specific starting point. So the visitor can pretty much just, walk around and, sort of create his own path. And I find this really interesting, sort of in terms of what kind of a version or what kind of an Anthropocene is assembled in an exhibition. So you have here, two very different versions of the Anthropocene. One that is really sort of something that you just, look at or read the history of the Anthropocene through these, technological inventions. And then here is sort of spatial sort of representation of the Anthropocene, where you can sort of, it's everywhere. It's all around you, and it's these different themes. It connects to urbanization, mobility, nature, evolution, humans and technology, and food. So here we have sort of something that I think creates a particular version that is pretty much possible because the exhibition is sort of three-dimensional, and you are thinking about sort of the movement of the visitor, and it sort of emphasizes that we are it's welcome to the Anthropocene. It's something that we are in right now, and what sort of the museum does is it assembles different objects as well. It's not only from the museum's collection, it's also artworks, sort of installations specifically designed for the exhibition, objects on loan, and sort of a really interesting sort of mix of things. The exhibition was created in collaboration between the museum and the Rachel Carson Center, which I think is also really interesting because you have sort of, well, the Rachel Carson Center is, of course, connected to the Deutsches Museum, but still, it's sort of you have the kind of the environmental humanities entering into sort of a museum that is focused on the history of science and technology. And what happened then, sort of shortly after the exhibition opened, they added sort of a few displays which were taken from sort of a performance kind of thing, which the Deutsches Museum was involved in with other institutions in the US. And it's sort of a performance that was called the Anthropocene Slam, a cabinet of curiosities in the Anthropocene. And some of these objects that were presented in this slam, which is sort of performance slash presentation, I found particularly interesting this one object here that doesn't really, grab your attention immediately, but it's a monkey wrench, and I think it's interesting particularly because what it sort of the intention of the person who actually performed the slam revolving around the monkey wrench, Dagan Miller, the historian. He was talking about sort of both the history of the object, but also what the object can do, because you can actually sort of use it to monkey wrench or tweak things. It connects to sort of the workers who were responsible for keeping these machines running, sort of people behind the scenes of the Industrial Revolution. And there is one particular quote I really sort of think is quite powerful, that he talked about that, in this whole sort of Anthropocene discussion, we are so focused on thinking about what humans are doing to the environment, we sometimes forget to think about what, us humans are doing to each other. So I think this is sort of a really, because this is a question that wasn't necessarily quite visible in the whole exhibition, but sort of somehow kind of, entered after the exhibition was opened, but sort of, had the potential to kind of pose this kind of question. So up to the third sort of, scale of analysis, the museum as an institution, I want to talk about the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, US. what I found really interesting about the Anthropocene at that particular museum is that they opened an exhibition in 2017. It was called "We Are Nature: Living in the Anthropocene," and it had a very sort of similar kind of emphasis on sort of approaching the Anthropocene as the tectonic plates at the Deutsche Museum. But what's kind of was different at the Carnegie Museum compared to the Deutsche Museum is that the museum wanted to kind of develop this concept and use it as a flagship concept or sort of a frame for the whole museum. So you had this temporary exhibition where they had in the middle of the exhibition they had these kind of this section about evidence where they gathered together different objects from the museum's collection, also objects that were kind of came from collaborators outside the museum, and created this sort of space where you could again sort of experience what it is to be sort of living in the Anthropocene. But further on, after the exhibition ended, they continued to kind of work with this, and now they have this. Well, the museum is divided into scientific sections, which is quite usual for a museum of natural history. But one of these sections is called Anthropocene Studies, and so what they have now is sort of an Anthropocene living room, which is really interesting thing, and it comes out of from this exhibition, because part of the exhibition they had that was focused on action. They had this small sort of book nook, sort of a place where you could sit down and read books. And they wanted to kind of build on that and keep this discussion going while also engaging with sort of different parts of the museum, combining research and things that are happening in botany, in the education department, and they are also working on sort of developing further sort of research projects within Anthropocene. So what is really interesting here is that just by kind of thinking in terms of the whole museum, they are creating sort of a more flexible Anthropocene in a way where you can talk about the Anthropocene, you can adapt it to, for example, they have this research project in botany where which is called recollection. So they're going to sites where they have samples in their collection that were collected 100 years ago. So they're revisiting these sites and collecting samples again in order to compare sort of how life cycles of plants have changed because of climate change. And by sort of starting to talk about the Anthropocene, it's you can easily kind of transfer this or assemble, put this research in context with the Anthropocene. So here you have sort of an example of the institution sort of becoming anthropocenic in a way. And while I was sort of visited there, I was talking to people working at the museum. I was walking around the galleries and hallways and corridors and storages, and I came across this grand staircase, and there they have these interesting sort of murals on the walls, which kind of put this history of the city and sort of the industrialization side of the city, and connects to Andrew Carnegie, of course, who is who started this museum, and kind of uplifts this progress idea of progress in a very sort of interesting directions. By you have these kind of angelic figures right next to steam and smoke, and you have workers. So I found it interesting that this story wasn't really addressed in the Anthropocene exhibition, and I talked to some of the people working there about this, and we had a conversation about this, and it was not really anything like oh, why aren't you talking about industrialization in your exhibition, accusing or anything like that. And I think they they took it they kind of agreed, and it's an interesting point. And I think even there is somewhere at the museum's website a short blog post about this conversation we had. And I also found that, in conversation with people working there, the question of colonialism came up as well. And sort of, that, oh, yes, we need to, decolonize, the natural history. But at the same time, that didn't really surface in the exhibition, which I thought was interesting. And I just want to bring up this quote here. This is from an article written by a few people who work at the museum, but also connected to another Anthropocene exhibition in Switzerland, where they are writing about Via Nature exhibition and the one in Switzerland. And this quote here, while both exhibitions paid some attention to climate justice and social inequity, overall they dealt very lightly with the politics of the Anthropocene and social and scientific critiques. As natural history museums and other science centers continue to explore the Anthropocene, there is an opportunity to collaborate effectively with social scientists and humanists in order to attend to these pitfalls wisely and develop more nuanced methods to account for economic inequalities, environmental justice, and other social cultural issues embedded into the Anthropocene, while also sharing science. So I thought it was really interesting, and this, puts this kind of awareness on paper, really, that the people working there are aware of these issues, but it's so far, they have dealt very lightly with the politics of the Anthropocene. And I say this is further reflected in a paper that was published very recently from in Museum and Society, which I have a short quote here, which is actually the article writes a really interesting review of 41 Anthropocene exhibitions. It's called A New Keyword in the Museum, Exhibiting the Anthropocene. And they sort of come to the same kind of conclusion, but phrase it in a very different way. Which is like, why aren't museums talking about responsibility, accountability, or colonialism and industrialization when they are dealing with the Anthropocene? And they say pretty much it's puzzling why the museum ignore or underplay these debates. Why do they not introduce to their audience some of the alternative and possibly more accurate terms such as capitalocene, Plantianocene, racial capitalocene, or even white supremacy scene? And I think this is really sort of an interesting and important question, and which I kind of, didn't really deal with specifically in my thesis. I was more focused on sort of, looking at how these different Anthropocenes appear in these museums, and through objects, exhibitions, and sort of the museum as an institution. And I must admit that this is something that I've been thinking about and trying to kind of sort of answer. And I think for me, in a way, perhaps it's not really puzzling. I mean, there is a way to kind of point out a few factors that actually play into the reason why museums ignore or underplay these debates. And I wanted to just, based on a very good article, sorry, I'm kind of losing. An article written by Heather Davis and Zoe Todd, which is called On the Importance of a Date, or Decolonizing the Anthropocene. So in this article, they actually propose that we should put the starting point of the Anthropocene tied to 1610 to actually highlight the sort of colonial logics, to highlight the beginning of colonization. And And so just for a short quote here, our contention here is that the Anthropocene, if explicitly linked to the beginnings of colonization, would at least assert it as a critical project that understands that the ecocidal logics that now govern our world are not inevitable or human nature, but are the result of a series of decisions that have their origins and reverberations in colonization. And I think this is a really important point and something that museums should take at heart, because museums, their history, their colonial legacy, they are very implicit in this kind of, this colonial project, which is basically where it was the very intentional alteration of habitat, dispossession and removal of people, and changing the environment. So it really also puts into focus this claim about the Anthropocene, that it's that it was kind of the unintentional consequences of technological progress, or this very all of a sudden now we're living in the Anthropocene. It kind of brings this more complex and important sort of historical perspective on where we are heading, and also deals with these questions of accountability and responsibility that I already sort of talked a little bit about. I just want to, now it's getting a bit kind of fragmented, and I apologize for that, but I wanted to kind of bring in, a few things, how we can actually sort of figure out the factors why museums are avoiding to address this, and how we can actually change that. So just an example, this is an article that appeared in The Guardian yesterday. It's from the Kew Gardens in Britain, a botanical garden that has actually sort of presented this 10-year manifesto where they are going to have this honest, as they call it, honest conversation about the botanical gardens links to imperialism and colonialism, and sort of connect that to environmental issues. And I think this is an issue that is coming up very regularly in museum studies, particularly, and that's this fact that museums are not neutral. And of course, this article is published in relation to this kind of fake cultural wars that they're trying to cook up in Britain, with where people are actually attacking honest and rigid historical work on the history of British Empire and imperialism, colonialism, and racism. So this is something that museums need to do. This is what they should be doing in order to address these questions. Like look at their own history, and also because it's not only about the past, it's something of an ongoing thing, colonialism. And I really sort of it's also about sort of listening and seeing what people, activists are saying. It's last year in February, people stormed the British Museum to actually protest the BP sponsorship of the museum, and linking it to the ongoing sort of colonial project of extraction of fossil fuels and such. So these are sort of very complicated issues, but not something that you can't address or anything. But you can see that this is, and I mean, increasingly becoming sort of a contested topic. And I think one other factor I want to mention, just sort of at the end, is also it's not only about the histories of the museums, but it's also about sort of museum profession, or the professionalization of museums, and sort of also these different disciplines. It's like you have to know your history of your discipline. You have to know the history of sciences, and kind of connects to the quote from put it back up here. um, here, where you have, you have to, there is an opportunity to address these issues, but, in this quote, they end by, while also sharing science. I mean, is that something separate from, these issues? Are you able to kind of separate science from, the socio-cultural issues, or question about inequalities, racism, colonialism, or, the overall sort of, question of environmental justice? So, yes, I think I'll stop now, and just thank you so much for listening. I hope this was made any sense, and I'm looking forward to, questions or comments. And I think, this is still sort of an, a very much open field, and I think, it's the more questions, the better. Thank you.